I think we're ready. Okay, so thank you for joining us. I see a lot of people on this virtual tour that I know, and some that are new to me, and some that I've even been to Edinburgh with before. You may have noticed a change in tour director on our tour. Our good friend George McFall has been extremely ill for the past week or so. He just found out today that he is not positive for COVID-19, which is awesome. I spoke with him earlier and he's beginning to feel a little bit better, but still has a nagging cough and a low-grade fever. So obviously it was not the best thing for him to be with us today. So in his absence, we are fortunate to be joined by his buddy and one of Scotland's finest tour director, Lewis Irvin. But before I hand it over, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Mara Walsh. I'm a group leader with EF Tours, and I started leading tours as a Girl Scout leader, taking girls and their families to international destinations each summer. I have since expanded my travel program. I've added adult-only tours as well as family-friendly tours. Since we're not able to travel this summer, and most of us are craving the experiences we gain while we're traveling, I thought it would be fun to travel virtually. So we had our first tour, as some of you know, a couple weeks ago to Rome. I know many of you joined us, and now today we're off to Edinburgh. I will follow this one with Paris and London in the coming weeks, and a few other destinations that are being figured out right now. Before we get going, I want to share a few ways for you to interact with us during this event. Okay, so feel free to ask questions about Edinburgh, about Lewis, and about my tour program by using the Q&A link on your toolbar. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the tour. You can also use the chat feature if you need to communicate with me directly at any time during the event. We're also going to have an interactive poll. In fact, let's do that right now. Let's find out a little bit about you and your connection to Edinburgh. I'm going to launch that poll now, which essentially is, what is your relationship with Edinburgh? I've been and can't wait to visit again. I'm booked on a trip to go, but I've never been there before. I've never been, but I plan to go in the future. Or I've never been, but I'm interested to experience it virtually. I'll give you a few moments to enter your responses, and when I see that most of you that are here have entered them, we will end the poll so that you can see our results and that we'll understand better what your connection with Edinburgh is. So it looks like you're still putting your responses in. I hope everybody can see the polls. Obviously, those people on Facebook cannot, but those people on Zoom are able to interact. This is interesting. Lewis, you'll see that most of the people here have been and can't wait to visit again. Not most of them, but the biggest percentage. Some are booked to go in the future, and then obviously there's a lot of people that are strictly just interested. So I'm going to end the poll so that we can all see the results of the poll, and I'm going to share the results with the audience. Okay, so now we all see the results, and I think that's telling for us, right? I'm going to stop sharing those results. And then, regardless of how connected you are to Scotland and Edinburgh, we hope to enhance that today on this virtual tour. And of course, a tour wouldn't be complete without a fantastic tour director. A tour director is like a personal travel concierge who stays with your group from start to finish and shares a world of knowledge, manages all your travel plans, and makes sure your experiences are stressless and full of positive experiences so that you make lifelong memories. These guys and gals are by far the most important people in your group. You can imagine that if we're not traveling this summer, they are not working at all, and this is their livelihood. I'm hoping that this virtual tour will not only reignite our desire to travel, but allow our tour director to do what he does best and share his knowledge and passion. And we're fortunate that Scotland has amazing tour directors. Thankfully, Lewis was able to step into this role with enthusiasm to share his knowledge with all of us today. So I'd like to introduce you to and hand over this tour to Scotland's own tour director, Lewis Irvin. Lewis, take it away.
Hi everybody, I've just clicked myself onto mute and I'm going to share my screen. So if you just bear with me for 2 seconds, then we should be good to go. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can all see. Hi, my name's Lewis. I've been a tour guide for EF for just over 10 years. And this is definitely the first time that I'm looking into a screen and not into people's faces while I'm going to be working and telling people a bit about the history of Edinburgh and a bit about its culture. This is a bit of a daunting experience. But I'm an Edinburgh native. I was born and raised in Edinburgh. I grew up there. I lived there until I was 17. And then I moved to the other side of Scotland, to Glasgow, where I lived for just over a decade, until I moved to Marseille in the south of France, which is where I'm calling you from just now. So Edinburgh is home. It's where my family are, but it's not where I live anymore. And a funny thing happens when you grow up in places, I think, that you have this idea that they're so everyday, they're so normal that they kind of lose their mystery to you, or they don't seem exciting, or it's difficult to find them beautiful. And I think that's something I really appreciate my job for, is that I feel like every time I take a group to Edinburgh, I get to see it with new eyes, and it's interesting in new ways. So I hope I get to do a bit of that today. My plan is to talk to you for probably just over half an hour, and I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to Scotland in general, and then talk to you a bit about some of the history and some of the stories of Edinburgh, and then a bit about sort of what life is like there today, and then we'll make space for questions at the end. But this will be very brief, like an overview. And I hope for those of you that have been there before, you'll learn something new, and for those of you that haven't, it will pique your interest. Often Americans are really disappointed that I don't have a very strong Scottish accent, so I've thrown in one little personal gem for you here, which is from my refrigerator, which is me wearing a little kilt when I'm small, just to prove that I'm Scottish if you're doubting the strength of my accent. So we're going to start. We're going to talk about a little bit of history, and so I've got this map here just to show the Celts. So I'm sure you will have heard of the Celts, and you can't really understand Scottish culture and Scottish history until you have a bit of an idea about who the Celts were and where they came from. You can see this map is from 400 BC. So you can see that in that time, the Celts took up a very, very, very big part of Europe. They were a really huge, sort of diverse society. And today, when we look at the Celtic nations, you can see here there's a little diagram of them. That's the Scottish flag there, the St Andrew's cross, the blue and white one. And in fact, there is Wales, you see, and Ireland on the left. And there's some other ones here as well, maybe that you didn't know, 2 English ones, Cornwall and the Isle of Man, and then Galicia in Spain, and Brittany in France. So these are the Celtic countries. And what really makes a Celtic country is that the culture has stayed on from Celtic times, okay? And so most of the Celtic countries have their own languages and their own dialects. In Scotland, we have Gaelic, which is a remnant from Celtic times. In Wales, Welsh. In Ireland, Gaelic, etc., etc. Now, who were the Celts, though? Like, what did they look like? What were they all about? I want to just maybe explain a little bit. Oh, no, that's the wrong slide. So sorry, that shouldn't have slipped in. That's very unprofessional. Here's a reconstruction of a Celtic man, a Celtic warrior. Over the last 10 years, they've done a lot of these sort of reconstructions where they've taken old bodies and they've taken old skeletons and they've tried to generate what the faces would look like. And so you'll be pleased to see that your average Celt just kind of looked like today's average hipster. But they weren't as interested in sort of craft beers and fixed gear bikes. They were more into agriculture and living in tribal societies, living in sort of kind of family units like clans, okay? And so they were very, when you think about people like the Romans, who were like this real centralized force, the Celts weren't like that. They were very dispersed. They lived in, like I say, kind of family units, okay? And they were, this is in Scotland, they were very religious, the Celts, and they were pagan. So this was pre-Christianity. They worshipped nature, they worshipped the sun, the moon, the changing of the seasons, etc., etc. And the stone circle that you see here, and in general, standing stones are one of the big remnants of that culture that are kind of all over Scotland. One little interesting thing that trickles forward into today's culture is that the Druids, who were like the kind of holy people of Celtic culture, they thought it was really it was forbidden for them to write down language. So language was never written down. And if you can't write things down, your history, your story, your culture, how do you pass it on? You have to pass it on through songs and through storytelling. And this is why all of the Celtic cultures have a rich oral folklore tradition. So this is why in Scotland we love singing songs and telling stories. Just here also the image of the Celtic cross is something people really associate with Ireland, but also with Scotland. And it's really interesting where the Celtic cross comes from. It comes from a time when the Romans were really trying to introduce Christianity in the British Isles, and they knew that the indigenous Celts really liked the symbol of the sun. And so actually this circle you see behind the crucifix, the classic Christian crucifix, is actually representative of the sun. So I always think that's a really interesting thing about how they legitimized a new sort of belief system as it came into the country. Okay, so here we're looking at a map of the United Kingdom. I'm going to get up into the present day or into Edinburgh very shortly, don't worry. But here we're looking at a map of the UK, and you can see on the left there's Ireland, which is partitioned into two countries, the Republic and Northern Ireland. You see at the top there's Scotland, at the bottom there's England, and kind of in the middle there's Wales. Now, when the Romans arrived in the 1st century, everybody in these islands was Celtic. Okay, that's just who lived here. And the Romans arrived in the bottom right-hand corner where London is. I hope you can all see that. And as they invaded, they pushed and they pushed and they pushed, and they got to roughly where Wales is. And actually the mountains came up and it got rainy and the people got wilder and the terrain got more difficult. And they thought, you know what, this is not worth it. And they dug a big ditch called Offa's Dyke. And they said, that's it. We're not going to push any more to the west. And a similar thing happened when they got to Scotland. They were like, these people are rough. It's too miserable. It rains too much. The terrain is too hard. You can't grow anything. Our feet are wet. This is horrible. We're going to build a wall. And so they built Hadrian's Wall, and they said, that's it, stop. We're not going any further north. They never even actually set foot in Ireland. And so that produces a system where at its base, and this is a bit of maybe a cognitive leap to make, but at its base, this is why Scotland, Ireland, and Wales remained Celtic countries. Okay, and England didn't. England was really settled by the Romans, who then stayed for many hundreds of years. And then when Rome fell, the world continued changing. But at its base, the kind of Celtic indigenous people to Scotland were never displaced. Okay, and so this is why we have the Celtic language. So if we're looking at this map of Scotland here, this is just Scotland itself. You can see those are the kind of principal cities. Edinburgh and Glasgow are the two biggest cities, and they're down in what we call the lowlands. Okay, so there's about 5 million people in Scotland. About 1 million of them are in Glasgow, about 500,000 in Edinburgh, but Edinburgh is the capital. And we have a lot of islands off to the left. And so if we look at this map of Scotland, actually there's kind of 3 principal regions in Scotland. We have the lowlands, which includes the borders. So this is kind of the kind of area where my parents live. So it's a lot of kind of rolling hills. It's very green, lots of forestry. That's in the lowlands. We have what Scotland's really famous for, in fact, which is the Highlands. This is a view from Glencoe. The Highlands is really amazing as well because it's very spaced out. So there's a lot of wilderness, a lot of nature, not so much population density, as it were. And then we have the islands also. This is Tobermory. This is one of the closer, it's not actually so far away from the mainland, but island life is really a thing in Scotland. And all over all of those islands, we have, incredible beaches. So maybe when you think about Scotland, you don't really think about beaches, but we have very beautiful beaches. But swimming in the sea is definitely only for the brave of heart because it's very, very cold. All right, and so there we go. This is Edinburgh. So that was I just wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to things about Scotland, and then maybe move actually on to telling you about Edinburgh and showing you a bit around it. So I started with this nice photo of Edinburgh at night. So you can see it's a very beautiful city with lots of interesting architecture from different periods. I want to start basically by telling you about the Old Town. Okay, so Edinburgh is a city of 2 towns, the Old Town and the New Town. The New Town, it's a bit funny that we call it a new town because I think you guys would agree it's quite an old town. It was designed in the 1760s. But for us, it's the New Town because essentially the town in Edinburgh, the Old Town, started 1,000 years ago. All right. So you see in this image here, this very old map, there's a kind of castle up on a hill on the left. So it's because in Edinburgh, there's these great big sort of volcanic shards of rock that stand up out of the land. And basically, since the Iron Age, people have lived on them because they've been really defensively sensible places to live. And since about the 11th century, so almost 1,000 years, there's been a castle up on top of this hill, on Castle Hill, okay? And the old town of Edinburgh really grew up around that. So if we look at this next map, you can see the castle on the left, and then right down on the right-hand side, it's hard to tell that that's what it is, but down on the right-hand side, that's a palace, okay? So the difference between a castle and a palace is that a castle is much more fortified, it's defensive, it can host royalty, they can live there, but also it can kind of defend itself. A palace is much more, you know, royalty swanning around and enjoying themselves. And so if you look in between the palace and the castle, it's connected by one long street, and this is the street that Edinburgh Old Town is very famous for. It's called the Royal Mile. You might have heard of it. Many of you have actually been there. I think 39% of you might have been there. And you can see it's kind of a little bit like a skeleton of a fish, the map, where you have the head on the left-hand side, and then you have this kind of spine going down the middle, and all of these tiny little passageways going off it, okay? And it's about 1 mile. But the thing that's difficult for those of you that haven't been there to capture from this picture is that this is not flat. It's kind of this shape, a doorstop. So if you imagine that the castle is on the top, super protected, cliffs all around one side, and the palace is on the bottom. So if you try and imagine that, whilst also thinking about, oh, hold on. There we go. If you imagine that whilst also thinking about this map, kind of doorstop there, so that you can get a bit of a better image here of the castle, okay? So there's the castle up on the hill. You can see lots of grey stone. You can see already the kind of rock face there and how that might be quite difficult to sort of penetrate or to attack. Here's a slightly older photo, you can see. And this is kind of what a lot of the old town in Edinburgh looks like today, okay? So it's quite amazing. The city really has a feel like there's multiple layers built on top of each other. So you can have one street at a lower level, another street at another level, lots of passageways, lots of sort of staircases. And I grew up there, and I still feel like I find shortcuts and staircases I didn't know about. This is Victoria Street. This is right up in the old town. Here's another view from the other side of the castle, where you can really see up into the size of that rock. And if you imagine, the old town is down on the other side of the castle, so we're looking up from what is now the new town. And also, this was a kind of imposing military structure, right? Even if you got up to the top and you were coming up there to try and start beef with the Scots, it would be kind of frightening, right? It's a big, imposing military presence on top of the hill. This is about halfway down the Royal Mile. This is a photo from the 19th century. So this is the toll booth. So we're kind of halfway down. We're looking up towards the castle. And you can see the kind of slope it is. It's not very extreme, but it is. You can tell that you're on a hill. And down at the bottom, we have this guy. This is Holyrood Palace. So this is the Queen's official residence in Scotland. She has an unofficial residence in Scotland, which is Balmoral. But her official one for sort of state business is here. It's Holyrood House. And she does a sort of ceremony every year where she has to go from here and get the keys, and she goes all the way up the Royal Mile to the castle. In Scotland, we have a bit of a complicated relationship with the monarch. It's a bit more complicated than in England. I think there's quite a lot of people who love and adore the monarch and want to have a royal family, but also a lot of people in Scotland that don't, and that feel like it's an outdated institution, or one that people need to move on from, or certainly find new ways to respond to. So it's a bit sometimes a bit of a bitter pill in Scotland, or people have quite different perspectives on the royal family. But right opposite this building is our Parliament, which is called Holyrood House, which you can see is quite a modern building. It was made in like 2004. It came in like 5 times over budget. It cost something like £400 million. It was really, really outrageous. I'll show you the inside. It's very, very modern. It was made by a Spanish architect. And if you see these kind of hairdryer looking shapes over the windows on the outside, those are supposed to be curtains being drawn open to represent transparency. And for me, I think it's really interesting in Edinburgh that we have this building, the Parliament, opposite this building, the Queen's House. And so for me, I think it's interesting because it's like you have this old institution of rulership and sovereignty, and then this new institution of rulership and sovereignty. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a tendency where guides or people trying to explain Edinburgh, they'll just stay in this terrain and they won't come to this terrain. And actually, this is really, really interesting from understanding where we've come from as a society and as a people and as a city. But this is really interesting for thinking about where we are now and where we're going. So I think the two of them are really interesting together. Anyway, Holyrood Palace, a lot of very famous monarchs, kings and queens who you would have heard of, have lived there over their time. I wanted to tell you just about two of them today. I'm going to tell you two stories. You can probably guess, if you know anything about Scottish history, which kings or queens I'm going to tell you about. So the first one is Mary, Queen of Scots. So Mary, Queen of Scots, she she just had such a miserable life, poor thing. She really, I don't think it was very nice to be a queen. It certainly wasn't very nice to be a woman in the 16th century. But she was born, she was the daughter of James V. She was due to inherit the throne of Scotland. And when she was a child, she was taken to France because she was too young to rule. And so they had what were called regents. So people that kind of they kept the throne warm for her, as it were, until she was of age to come back. And so when she did come back, and she was very Catholic, because France was very Catholic, when she did come back, she came back to a Scotland that was actually very, very changed, and it didn't feel so nice. I'm sure some of you will know about the Reformation and things that happened in the Tudor times under Henry VIII with the stripping of the power from the Catholic Church. But she came back and Presbyterianism was getting very strong in Scotland. And so people weren't so keen on this sort of foreign Catholic queen. So she came back and it wasn't very, very nice for her. She came back in 1561. And she just had a lot of really horrible stuff happen to her. She was married to this man called Lord Darnley. She had a personal secretary, and people believed she was having an affair with him. He was called David Rizzio, and she was pregnant. And there was lots of gossip in the court that people said that David Rizzio was the parent. It wasn't her husband. And then in the left tower of this building, there was a horrible scene where her husband and basically a bunch of thugs came into the room where she was having a meeting with him and stabbed him 60 times to death in front of her. And part of the idea was to try and shock her, to make her miscarriage what they thought was a child out of wedlock. So really horrible. She watched her lover be stabbed to death. Not long later, her husband was then murdered himself. And then she married the person people had thought had maybe murdered her other husband. And then she got chased from the throne. So it kind of gets more miserable. It actually gets more miserable than this, because her cousin, Elizabeth I, she was on the throne, and she called her up and said, look, I'm in big trouble up in Scotland. Can I come and can you look after me? And Elizabeth I was like, no worries, cuz I've got you. This is a family thing. But in fact, it was a bit of a trick. And she imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, for 19 years, okay, all over the country. So you would struggle to find a remote kind of a castle or stately home in Scotland where Mary, Queen of Scots didn't spend at least some time being very, very sad in the 16th century. So she had a very miserable life. Eventually, she was then beheaded for a plot to try and kill her cousin. So miserable. So she stayed in this building. That's one connection to Edinburgh. The next one I want to talk about is, for me, the most interesting one of all of them. And then I'm going to move a bit on from this really ancient history. Don't worry, in case it's boring for you. This is James I, or James VI. So he was James VI of Scotland, but there had never been a James of England, and he took the throne of England. So he gets remembered as James I of England, which always bums me out a little bit. So I try and call him James VI rather than James I. And he, I think, in any case, I think he was probably not a very nice man. And he didn't do very nice things with his life, but I just feel like he had a very incredible life. So there's kind of 5 principal things that happened in his life that he was an actor in, that I think are really, just incredible to imagine one human life that could contain so many things. So the first one is the beginning of colonization in the United States, or like thinking about the Americas more. Think about Jamestown. The second one is the King James Bible, okay, which is the first properly sort of readily available English language Bible, which is very important for the Reformation. The third one is the Ulster Plantation, which is the kind of beginning of the partitioning of Ireland. Maybe Ireland would never have partitioned into 2 countries if it hadn't been for James the Sixth. He also was openly or known to be gay, and in the 16th century, it's kind of quite shocking or quite surprising. He was married and he had a wife, but he had mostly male lovers. And the last one, he brought in a big, big way to Scotland the fear of witches. And so that's what's going to be really important next for our story, for continuing about Edinburgh. He brought the fear of witches. He very famously wrote a book about witches and witchcraft in Scotland. Okay. Here's a document that he commissioned actually in Edinburgh. It's an image of women being tempted by witchcraft. So I will say before I show you how this relates to Edinburgh that I think that the period of time that we now know as the witch hunts, when 3,000 or 4,000 women and men were killed in Scotland for being witches, was obviously not really a hunt for witches and was something a bit more politically sinister. So it was a time when medicine, which had always been the domain of women, thinking about plants and traditional medicine, was suddenly becoming a masculine profession, and it was becoming very professionalized. It was becoming something you could learn in a university or a school, and so it was a threat to men that women had this knowledge. And so at its base, this kind of fear, this thing that was driven also by the church, was also about a fear about women knowing too much and having too much power, because they had more of a position of power with regards to health. Anyway, it came to Scotland very, 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 very fast. So here we're at the top of the Royal Mile, okay, with this image. And this is a small commemoration for a woman who was called Agnes Finney. So Agnes Finney lived in Edinburgh in the 1600s, and she sold fish and she sold cakes. She was a widow, and she had been accused of poisoning people and of putting curses on them. And so in 1644, she was tried for witchcraft, and she was convicted of 20 counts of witchcraft, and she was executed in Edinburgh. Now, the way they executed people is it's not nice. I want to tell you a little bit about it. So if I go back to show you, where is it? If you imagine this is the esplanade. So when I say esplanade, I'm talking about here. So the first thing that they would do to decide if you were a witch was they would take you down to a place called the Norloch, which is in Edinburgh. I'll show you where this is in a second. And they would put you on a contraption like this, which is called a ducking stool. All right. And so the idea is they duck you under the water, right? They duck your head under the water, they'd hold you under the water. And if you drowned, that meant you were not a witch. And if you didn't drown, that meant you were a witch, and then you needed to be punished. So, I mean, obviously it's not a great system. It's not a very fair system. And if you were going to be punished, you'd be taken back up to the esplanade of the castle. You'd be put into a barrel. They'd drive nails into the barrel and they'd roll it down the hill. I mean, really, we're not known for being the nicest of people, but I think in the 1600s, it really, really wasn't nice to live in Scotland. That, or you'd be burnt at the stake. So witch hunting was a very, very big part of life in Edinburgh's Old Town. If you look at this drawing of the Old Town, you can see the castle up on the hill and then all of the buildings stretching out underneath it, and that body of water down at the bottom there, that's what was the Norloch. Now, this is really disgusting, but the Norloch was basically just a sort of huge pit of sewage, okay, of human waste. So back then, the houses were very, very close together in the Old Town. Many of them were made of wood, okay? They were so close together that you could reach out and you could shake hands with your neighbor across the street. And people, they didn't have a sewage system, you know, they would literally just throw the buckets of waste down, and it would all run down into this kind of water. So it was very, very disgusting. There were also lots of sort of narrow alleyways. This one here is called World's End's Close. A close is a kind of alleyway in Scots. And so it was a very unhygienic place, and disease was very, very, very rife. Disease was very, very rife, and it just became very, very unhygienic, and there were too many people crammed into too small a space. Which brings us on to the new town. So in the 18th century and the early 19th century, the Enlightenment happened in Scotland. So there was this big movement of sort of thinkers and writers and scientists who were thinking with these humanist ideas, these rationalist ideas. They were thinking about society and what it means. People like David Hume, people like Adam Smith, people like Robbie Burns, some of you might have heard of. And so there was also at this time a kind of new merchant class developing in Edinburgh. And to be honest, this kind of stinky old town with all of these really old skyscrapers and kind of poop everywhere, it wasn't seeming so appealing to this developing merchant class, okay? They wanted something new. And so in the 1760s, they launched, hold on, I'm trying to make this work, a competition to design a new town. Okay, so this was designed by James Craig in 1760. You're looking at the plan. And down in the bottom left is where the castle would have been. Okay, so they made this idea that they were going to build a new town down from the castle, and then people could move out there and the poor could stay up by the castle. And so you look, it's very grid-like. There's two big squares at the end, St. George's Square and St. Andrew's Square. A big street in the middle, St. George's Street. George III, he was the king at the time. But to do this, they would have to build a bridge down from the castle, from that kind of doorstop shape I showed you, to the new town. So here's a kind of drawing of how they imagined it, because the old town was up on a hill, they'd have to bring it down. Here's an even more kind of romantic one. If you imagine really that at times when they released these drawings, these seemed like sort of wild, futuristic ideas, like how could we build a bridge down like that, down from the old town to the new town? And so they built these bridges. This is a photo in the 19th century. But what this means is that Edinburgh was really built layers over layers, okay? And so these bridges, many of them were hollow. Many of them were built on old empty streets. And it means there's a lot of quite grim stuff in Edinburgh about sort of ghosts and sort of more paranormal stuff. There's a whole industry of sort of guided tours about seeing in the sort of underground Edinburgh. And there's a lot of very miserable stories about, for example, people with the plague being bricked into the underground passages alive and all this kind of stuff. So under these vaults, inside these bridges and under the old city, you have lots of kind of quite creepy places where people lived. People that didn't have the money to live in apartments where there was light would pay to live, and all of the kind of horrible stuff that you can imagine comes with that. This is what one of the bridges looks like today. This is North Bridge. And so you see now it kind of looks even just a little bit dated, you know, like a 19th century bridge. And it connects the old town down to the new town. Now here's a really good image to give you a picture much better of the city. So if I talk you through this image a little bit, you see on the right, there is the castle in that kind of thing of green. Down there, Princess Street Gardens is where there used to be the Nor Loch, which they had to drain. The Royal Mile runs down from the castle, away from where we're looking, through that stadium. And then all of this in the middle, these kind of several blocks and these parks, these are the Georgian squares laid out by in the new town. And so this is, for example, one of the buildings. This is in Charlotte Square. This is where our first minister, Nicola Sturgeon, this is where she lives. She's kind of like our prime minister. And these are very typical Georgian architecture houses. So, for example, the ironwork railings, the crescent-shaped detailing above the door, and also the fact that the windows get smaller the higher you go up the building. Okay, and this was firstly because the top floor was often for servants or for children, but secondly also because the Georgians were so obsessed with appearance. And if you make the windows get progressively smaller the higher up you go, if you're down on the ground, it makes the building look bigger. So this is another sort of feature of Georgian architecture. And the reason that it's the stone is blackened, and you'll have noticed in lots of the photos like that, is from coal burning, which you can't do anymore, but which we did for a very, very long time. Here's a nice little photo also, just to see this is a photo from the new town looking up to the old town. So you can see actually when you look at it all together, it doesn't look that inconsistent. But if you pay a little bit of attention, you can see these buildings down in the foreground. They're really from the last, couple of hundred years. And those buildings up on the old town, you can see actually they're quite a bit older. So you can see there is a kind of difference. And the style of the new town was in a kind of Greco-Roman style. So apart from being called Old Reekie, which means Old Stinky, because it was a big sewage lake, Edinburgh was also called the Athens of the North in some moments. So the last little section I want to talk about is I just want to talk a bit about Edinburgh today and why people come and visit it. And I guess I've started with this photo, which is taken from Arthur's Seat, which is the dormant volcano in Edinburgh. And you can see the castle there, and you can see some kind of more normal and less old-fashioned looking housing down there as well. But I show you this picture just to say that it's quite amazing because it's a big city and it feels like a big city. But also at the same time, there's a real vibe that you feel like you can be in the countryside very quickly. You can be outside very quickly. There's a big university in Edinburgh. It's actually the 5th oldest English-speaking university in the world, and it's a really big one. There's about 40,000 students. So there's also a number of other colleges, but the university is very big, which means that the student population is big, which means that there's a kind of a bit of a lively young energy to the city sometimes, which definitely translates into its political culture. So this is a photo from 2014. Maybe some of you were even in Scotland that year, where we had a referendum for independence. Roughly half the population voted against it and half for it, okay? So that would be independence from the United Kingdom. Scotland in general We are much more on a kind of left political spectrum than England. But because our parliaments are yoked together, they have kind of the final say on many of our laws. And so for a lot of us in Scotland, myself included, we wanted an independent Scotland. It didn't work. We lost in 2014. But it could very well be coming back because the Brexit is really going to impact that. If any of you have any questions about that, also you're welcome to ask. Here's a photo of a sort of pro-independence demonstration in 2014. But also it's a nice image because here you can really get a picture of the Royal Mile. So this is really kind of what it looks like today. There's no more people throwing buckets of pee out of the windows anymore. It's really not like that. It's all indoor plumbing. This is not a picture from a protest. This is a picture from the Edinburgh Fringe, which you may have heard of, which is it happens in August every year. It's the world's biggest arts festival, which seems really it's quite impressive. There's 55,000 performances over about 300 venues for a month. And so people come from all over the world. Lots of street performers, lots of sort of edgy sort of fringe theatre. People love it. It's really, really popular. People love it, but people from Edinburgh don't really love it. And often they'll Airbnb their flats and then they'll go elsewhere. But that's a really huge pull for people to come and see Scotland. I think I'd probably get in trouble if I didn't talk about Harry Potter, so I'm going to do a little bit about Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling obviously is from Edinburgh, and this is the Elephant House, which is a coffee shop in the old town of Edinburgh, where famously she is supposed to have written the first book. And there's this whole story about how she didn't have any money, and she had to write in cafes because it was the best way for her to stay warm. And we all know that by the time she was writing the last book, she was wealthy enough that she wrote it here, in the entire top floor of the Balmoral Hotel, where she had the entire suite to herself to write the last one. She's actually quite a big public figure in Scotland, J.K. Rowling. She's quite controversial. She came out very, very strongly against Scottish independence, and she's taken a lot of sort of political positions in the last few years. So people have a lot of strong feelings about her. But Edinburgh is really littered with things that are said to have inspired her in her writing of the Harry Potter books. So this is George Heriot's school. This is, sorry, it's a bit pixelated. It doesn't really look that pixelated in real life, but this is George Heriot's school. This is where her kids went to school. She would pick them up here, and people say that this is one of the inspirations for Harry Potter. It's next to this churchyard, Greyfriars Kirk. Kirk is a Scots word meaning church, and so Greyfriars Kirk is right next door, and we know that she would walk in the graveyard, and there's lots of graves there which people say have inspired some of the names in the Harry Potter books. So you see one here, Moody, Mad-Eye Moody is a character in the Harry Potter series. McGonagall, maybe an inspiration for Professor McGonagall, and the big one that's really kind of a bit irrefutable, Thomas Riddell, aka Voldemort. So we know that she saw this grave every day, and then that this name made it into her books. It would be shocking if it was a surprise. This might look a bit disgusting to you. To me, this looks really not disgusting at all. It looks very, very, very delicious. We're known for loads of stuff, maybe our sense of humor, that we're welcoming, but we're just not, I'm going to be honest, we're just not known for our food. It's just not something, it's not a strong point of Scottish culture. It rains all the time. We can't really grow stuff. It's just, there's other stuff that's nice apart from food, but there's some really nice foods, but it's not going to be sort of, high-end, sort of luxurious food. So you're looking at a can of Iron Brew and a deep-fried Mars bar. Iron Brew is the sort of national drink. Some people will tell you the national drink of Scotland's whiskey, but actually, really, it's Iron Brew. Iron Brews are kind of incredibly, incredibly processed, overly sugared soda, which is available in Scotland. When I was a kid, you couldn't even buy it outside of Scotland. You couldn't even buy it in London. Now you can kind of get it a bit more in other places because of globalization, but Scotland is one of only 2 countries in the world where the best-selling soda is not Coke. The other one is Peru, where they have a drink called Inca Cola. And actually, once I had a Peruvian group who told me that Iron Brew tastes almost exactly like Inca Cola, which is quite weird. And the other thing in this picture is a deep-fried Mars bar. Can't remember if you have Mars bars in the US. It's basically a candy bar, a chocolate bar, and we batter it and we deep-fry it. It's really, really delicious, actually, and I would really recommend it. People in Scotland, they love deep frying things, really. If in Edinburgh you go into a fish and chip shop and you order a pizza supper, it's half a pizza battered, deep fried, and then served with fries. So we're really into the frying things, really frying things a lot. So luckily we have a sort of free universal healthcare system, because we have a lot of problems with heart disease in Scotland, because we're frying everything all the time. This is what we're probably most famous for, the haggis. Haggis is the real most traditional meal in Scotland. Doesn't it look appetizing? It is traditionally the heart, liver, lungs, and intestines of a sheep, minced with spices and onions, and then boiled in a sheep's stomach. And then we get it out, we recite a traditional poem. While we cut it open, we squeeze it, and then we serve it. Okay. I've just noticed actually there's a digital thermometer in this picture. We're very moving with the times in Scotland. You wouldn't want to undercook your haggis. Actually, maybe that sounds not very nice to any of you. It's actually quite delicious. And they make a lot of vegetarian haggises in Scotland. 1 in 3 haggises sold in Scotland these days is a vegetarian haggis. And so there it looks quite kind of glamorous and sophisticated. Actually, how it usually arrives on the plate is like this. It looks maybe a little bit more like something that you would feed a dog, but it's very delicious. It just doesn't look very delicious. Sometimes if you go to a fancy restaurant, they'll put it in a little pile. But in general, if you eat it in people's houses, usually around the end of January, this is what it looks like. And that's the haggis on the left, and it serves with neeps and tatties. Neeps are turnips. That's the orange thing on top. And tatties is a Scottish word for potatoes. It's just mashed potatoes. Pubs also is a very big part of Scottish culture, and Edinburgh is really full of them. It's a really big part of social life. Here's one down in the Grass Market in Edinburgh, in the Old Town, which is where they used to have the hangman's block. So it's where they used to hang people. And you see the pub is called The Last Drop, and just in the little sign above the door, you can see a hangman's noose. And in a country that rains so much, that's really kind of quite cold and difficult to be outside a lot, we really benefit from having nice pub interiors. And the pub is really a bit of a kind of pillar of social life, not just in Scotland, in all of the UK really, but in Scotland certainly, as a place to be, not at home, but not at work, when you can't really be outside in the streets. There we go. That's, I've talked for about how long I said I would talk for. I hope that was interesting, or I hope that piqued some interest in coming to Scotland. I feel like it's really impossible to try and condense the things that I would like to tell you about Edinburgh into, less than sort of hours and hours and hours. Because normally if we go on tour, we have at least sort of 2, maybe 2.5 days where I can show people around the city and show them things to do and things to eat and things to see. And so this was also an interesting experience for me to try and condense that into a half an hour online, speaking to 100 odd people who I cannot see. So I hope it was useful or interesting. And I think Mara is going to come back on now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Lewis. And thanks so much for jumping in. I know that you could probably do this in your sleep if you were walking through Edinburgh, but I know how much time and energy it takes to find the graphics and put it all together for a virtual tour. So thank you very, very much.
No worries.
We're going to go into our Q&A aspect of the tour now. Before we do, I just want to mention that tips are optional. However, we do appreciate anything you can give, even if it's just a tiny bit. It's like crowdsourcing, a little bit together makes a great big chunk. And Lewis gave up, obviously, with COVID-19 and all of the canceled tours. He had 10 scheduled for this year, and he is doing 0. So we want to show him our appreciation for his time today. And we want to just remind you that the Q&A on the bar below or above you, wherever it's situated, if you just click on that and you enter a question for Lewis, he's going to jump over to the questions now and start to address them. So again, I'm gonna sort of take a step back and let Lewis come back on with some of the questions.
Thank you, Mara. I just saw all of these messages about my volume. I'm really sorry. I was supposed to be looking at that, and I was too carried away with my presentation. So sorry if it was quiet for anyone.
Lewis, I think we addressed it midway, so I think we're okay.
We got it. Okay, great. Thank you for the questions that are coming in and the comments. I am going to answer some of them. Maybe I'll start. There's a question from Brandy, which was what was the sign that said World's End Close? So like I said, a close is it's like a kind of an alleyway that comes off the Royal Mile, typically because they're very close. And in Scotland, a close is also the stairway, so like the stairwell of an apartment building. And so, oh, hold on. I've lost it, the question. I know you've answered it, that's why. And so the World's End Close is a close on the Royal Mile that's next to a very famous pub called the World's End Pub, which is a good pub if ever you're in Edinburgh. And it was called the World's End Pub because at that point there was a wall built around the old town, and people really, they could live their whole life without really going outside of that wall. And so it was a bit of a joke that where the wall was the World's End. And so there was a World's End Pub, and this is why it's called the World's End Close. Okay, let's have another question. This is from Bet. What is the best time to visit? How would you compare Edinburgh and Glasgow? So, Edinburgh and Glasgow have a very fierce rivalry. And I have a bit sort of vested interest because I grew up in Edinburgh, but I kind of betrayed Edinburgh and I moved to Glasgow and lived there for a decade. Glasgow, it's like, I don't know. I find it interesting comparing them. Glasgow's much bigger. It's much more metropolitan. It's much more diverse. I feel like it's much more forward thinking and forward looking than Edinburgh. Edinburgh has so much like beauty and history to rely on. And so to some extent, they don't need to be dazzling visitors with their forward thinking or something. And Glasgow is maybe a little bit less dazzling to look at, but actually the sort of the depth of things that are happening there in terms of art or food or politics or culture, it's a bit more vibrant, and there's a lot more young people living there. So it's much bigger as well. And I think lots of people on the tourist trail, people visiting for tourism, they don't visit Glasgow, and that's enormously a shame because it's a really amazing city. Is the castle, this is from Kathleen, is the castle at the top of the hill in use today for something other than a tourist attraction? Yes, it's kind of complicated because a lot of the things that are around the royal family, it's like they have functions, but they are also largely functioning as tourism now. Okay, so it's still officially a sort of royal chartered building. As such, they keep guns in there. There are guns in there. There are cannons in there. They fire. The 1 o'clock gun is fired every day from Edinburgh, and also there's a church building in there. At this point, it's so historic and there's so much interest in seeing these spaces that it's kind of hard to see how much they're tourism and how much they're just the fabric of the city. And a lot of events, big cultural events, happen up at the castle. So it's used for things that also impact people who aren't just tourists and who are people from the city. Okay, a question from Sashaline. For the last drop, were the hangings in the stairwell area or just the general area that the bar is located? No, they were out in the public square. So that's a bar off the side of a public square, and the gallows were in the middle of the public square. So not in that little alleyway. Question from Jennifer Humphreys. Very good question. This feels like a test question from someone who's already been to Edinburgh. Are the crown jewels housed in Edinburgh? Yes, the Scottish crown jewels are housed in Edinburgh. And this was a very big drama because basically Scotland had a really miserable time for a long time in relation to England. There was a real 100 years where the King and Queen didn't even visit Scotland because they didn't even really care. And when they were making the new town, George III, he got all interested in Scotland. Okay, and there was a guy called Sir Walter Scott, who was a novelist who wrote these novels about Scotland and kind of made Scotland sexy to an English audience. Okay, and people were like, oh, Scotland, maybe that's not just a bunch of kind of rough, horrible brutes up north of the border. Maybe that's really nice how they dress and how they are. And so there was kind of interest in Scotland and people wanted to travel there. And so they brought the crown jewels out. The crown jewels had basically been in a box covered in dust for a long time, and they are on display in Edinburgh Castle itself. Not to be confused with the crown jewels of the crown jewels, the classic crown jewels, which are in the Tower of London. Question from Sarah Jones. It looks like the old town is popular today. Is that so? Is it an expensive area to live? I cannot even begin to describe how expensive it must be to live there. I once had to visit someone's house that lives really in the old town. I was doing my master's degree, and we had to meet some expert on book history, and we went to his house, and oh my god, it was like something from an Indiana Jones film. I mean, really, you have to have a lot of money to live in the old town, but it's very, very, very popular for tourists. And also it's really beautiful. I think Edinburgh, like people from Edinburgh would be in the old town. You'd go out for lunch or you'd go and eat there, but very few people would really live up on Castle Rock. I'm going to scroll up a bit because I think I'm missing some of the earlier ones. Oh, it's a really good question from anonymous attendee, a question that I can't answer. What is the oldest kirk in Edinburgh and what faith, if any, is practiced there? I don't know. It's a really, really good question. I couldn't tell you what the oldest kirk in Edinburgh is. But I think almost certainly Protestantism or a non-Catholic denomination of Christianity. Yes, the university photo, Nancy Bernier. Yes, the university photo was a photo of university, Edinburgh University, of one of the buildings of Edinburgh University. Got a question. Okay, from Janie. What's the best time to visit with not too many crowds? I was there in early October 2019. I mean, if the thing you really want to avoid is crowds, then winter. But then you have to put up with the absolutely horrific weather. So it's kind of a no-win situation. I think the worst time to come if you want to avoid crowds is June, July, August. And those are kind of the only times when it's maybe warm enough to be pleasant. So I think spring is really nice. The beginning or middle of autumn is nice. Yeah. Question from Nancy. My orchestra was invited to the Stirling International Music Festival, which was postponed. I'm sorry. Do you know this festival? Is July a good month to visit? Our accommodation with University of Edinburgh. I've realized that in the last question, I just said avoid visiting Edinburgh in July. And then the next question is July a good month to visit? I only said it's not a good month to visit if what you're trying to avoid is crowds. I think in any case, July and August, Edinburgh is really, the energy is really, there's a lot of people. And that other question felt like it was about avoiding people being crowded. So I don't know the music festival, but I know Stirling, and Stirling's a really nice town. And that could be, I imagine, quite nice to get out of Edinburgh and spend some time in Stirling in the months when Edinburgh's very, very busy. Favorite place to get fish and chips, Brooke Wills? Excellent question. I would say the Clamshell, which is on the Royal Mile. And they also do deep fried Mars bars. Okay. Chris Gibson, have you ever participated in the Highland Games? No. I'm such a lowlander. They'd kick me out. I've got no idea. I wouldn't be able to do that. Diane, if planning a trip to Scotland, what are the high points not to miss? Like I said, Glasgow for me is a really big one. The thing that I think the most tourists miss, which actually is, for me, really the best thing in Scotland, and I really said that best thing. I didn't say one of, I said best, is the islands. Like when people really have the energy to get out of the cities, they only think about wanting to go to the Highlands, but the islands are so amazing. And you can get kind of tickets to take the ferries between different islands. It's another way of living. It's really, really beautiful. And also in the Highlands, I think for me, Glencoe is probably the most beautiful place for me in Scotland. So Glencoe in the Highlands, or kind of any of the islands, are really, really, really nice. And some of them are very accessible. Some of them you don't even have to take a boat. Skye, there's a bridge. If I could only choose one castle to visit, this is from Carol McCarrick, would it be Edinburgh or Stirling? Sorry about my spelling. No worries about your spelling, Carol. No, Stirling. I think Stirling's more interesting because it's like you can see more or something. It's like if it's been developed less. It's a kind of similar concept to Edinburgh Castle. It's up on a rock. You're looking out at big panoramic views. I like Stirling because it's not sort of full of built-up developments around it. So you can there's like little information plaques where you can read about like the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and you can really see where William Wallace advanced and all this kind of stuff. So I think Stirling Castle's I like it more. Janie, are there standing stones very near Edinburgh? I don't know. Like famous big ones, no. But the thing is, in Edinburgh, in Scotland, there's kind of standing stones everywhere. Just not that many of them. Or often you'd see very small ones. But in terms of big ones, no, I don't know. You have to go up more north for the more famous circles. Kathleen Sullivan, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the tour. Can I speak more about Arthur's Seat? No. I can tell you there's lots of swans that live there, that it's really pretty all year round. It's nice to go jogging. You can drive up to the top. It's a dormant volcano. That's all I got though. I'm sorry. Um, dun, dun, dun. Robin, is there a particular shop or spot that a Harry Potter fan should absolutely not miss while they're there, aside from what was mentioning? Any that are overly touristy or waste of time? I don't know. The real sort of the Harry Potter shop that everybody goes really bananas about and that everybody loves is in London at platform 9 3/4. In Scotland, I think I would be lying if I said that I was like really fully in touch with the Harry Potter shopping scene. Other than that, I know from experience that when I have groups that are really into Harry Potter, they want to go to the Elephant House and they usually want to get a picture of themselves there. And I feel like in Edinburgh, maybe it's more like yeah, seeing landmarks that are relevant to them than necessarily shopping. I couldn't tell you which shops are good and which shops are bad for that. I'd be making it up. Carrie Griffith, how many days do you recommend staying in Edinburgh if traveling through the whole country? So if you have a 10 to 14-day trip, I mean, it would depend if it was at the beginning or the end or the middle, but I would say at least 3 days. Yeah, I would say at least 3 days. Hold on, I'm going to think about this next one. MB Dan, what are your favorite off the beaten path locations? I imagine that this question is about Edinburgh, not just in general in the world. If it's about Edinburgh, a neighborhood, like two neighborhoods that are really nice to explore: Stockbridge, which is in the new town, which is just really old fashioned and amazing, sort of Georgian architecture and lots of independent shops, and Leith down in the docks, which is a bit more kind of a young, trendy sort of cultural neighborhood, places that I like. Bum, bum, bum. Diane Bazil, would you recommend visiting the Shetland Islands or are they too remote? Oh my God, I'd love to visit the Shetland Islands. It's always been too remote for me. I think if if you have the chance to go to the Shetland Islands, definitely go to the Shetland Islands. I mean, I feel like I don't know anyone that has managed to go apart from the few people I know that are from there. But from everything I hear, they're absolutely, absolutely amazing, beautiful. The Shetland Islands, and also Orkney are really, but I feel like those islands at the top, people go to them much less than all of the islands on the western coast. Bum, bum, bum. Cheryl Olive, what are the seasons for hurling and Gaelic football? When could we go and maybe see a live game? Gaelic football isn't really played in Scotland. It's played in Ireland, and hurling neither. But we have a version of hurling which is called shinty, which is played in the Highlands, which is really basically just hurling. But we don't really play Gaelic football in the same way. It's much more in Ireland. So this is really impressive. This is a lot of questions. Chris, when was tartan popularized in Scotland? Tartan has been used in Scotland for a really incredibly long time. So the whole thing with the crisscrosses was about weaving and different colors that were available in different areas, different dyes that were available for wool. And most of the big families, they would have a regimental tartan that was more like a kind of reddy one, which is more for ceremony, and then a kind of bluey greeny one, which is more for hunting and for being in the countryside. And tartan got really much more. People have been making kind of tartan, but maybe less neat and more functional, like very sort of thick and strong woven cloths for really 800 years. And in the 19th century, it got very popularized and it became more fashionable. Okay, but back in the day, tartan and cloths that were made into kilts would be really like, they'd be so heavy and dirty and grimy that they would be almost waterproof. You know, like, yeah. Jennifer Humphreys, was Braveheart filmed in the Highlands? Don't know. Gonna say no, but could be. But you know what? People were so mad about Mel Gibson playing Braveheart in that film in Scotland that they made a statue. They commissioned a statue outside of Stirling Castle at the Wallace Monument, and it was supposed to be a statue of William Wallace called Freedom. And then when they unveiled it, it's literally just a statue of Mel Gibson. And people were so annoyed that it got really repeatedly vandalized by the people of Stirling, until the point that the local council had to put it in a cage to stop people vandalizing it. So you had a statue called Freedom that they had to put in a cage to stop people from vandalizing it. And eventually it got vandalized so much they took it away. It's like really like £20,000 of public spending money went on a statue of Mel Gibson. People hated so much. So I don't know. I think people in Scotland feel ambiguous sometimes about that film, because honestly, everywhere we go in the world, people just want us to say that line. Honestly, it's happened to me. It happened to me in a international house of pancakes in an IHOP in Kentucky or somewhere, that they were like, please say the line from Braveheart, please, 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 please. So I don't know if it was filmed in the Highlands, but yeah, I don't know. Jen, what are the EF names of the tours that you give? For example, we toured Ireland and Scotland with the Highland Extension, and I would have loved to have spent even more time in Scotland. Do you offer a Scotland in-depth tour? In fact, I think this year is the first year that yes. And obviously this year everything's cancelled, but next year, I think now for the first time they've started offering a Scotland in-depth one, but I don't know exactly what the itinerary is. Okay, I think the only one left that's a question is from Jessica Ferry. What is your favorite place to take your groups? Again, I wonder if that means in Edinburgh or in Scotland or in the world. I don't know how to answer that question. Should I answer if it's just for Edinburgh?
Yes, start there.
I like it. Thanks. Little prod there. I in general really like getting outside and getting to breathe a bit of fresh air with groups. So I really like going up Arthur's Seat, which I've done with a lot of groups, and I really like going up Carlton Hill. Like I feel like when you can walk a little bit, get your blood pumping a little bit, and then have a nice view of the city, that's really what I like. So those kinds of outdoors things with groups in Edinburgh.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Lewis. That was really amazingly great. If you're still on, the slide is up. Just take a screenshot with your phone or take a screenshot with your computer or device so that you know where you can drop a tip here and there. And if you want to get in contact with Lewis, or if you want to follow up with me, you know my email address and my contact information. So please do that. And again, Lewis, I can't thank you enough. I know you jumped in at the 9th hour to save George and provide us with a great tour of Edinburgh. And we all appreciate your time. And we learned a lot. I know I did. I've been there several times. I came away with some fun stories, so I always appreciate them.
Great.
So it's very late for Lewis right now. I think it's after midnight. So
Yeah.
tonight, and for everybody else, go get your dinner and have a cocktail or do whatever you do at this time. Thanks a lot and have a good day.